So, Erna, you've really been interested in augmentative and alternative communication for many years. Where do you think we are in terms of the field and AAC?
Shakila, I think we've made enormous strides since we started this field, and I think it's evident in many ways, but I think primarily our biggest gains have been in the field of technology, and what we've been able to do to supplement people's speech, particularly those who have so little and need an additional way of communicating. I think apart from speech-generating devices, apart from a whole range of switches that gives people access to it, the latest development in terms of iPads, I think, is really iPads or Androids, and applications is really opening a whole new world to everybody. Yes. Having said that, I think we have improved the accuracy with which we can communicate, people can communicate and express messages. We certainly have increased on the rate that people are able to communicate with, which we know is really pivotal. And the portability to some extent, because things are getting smaller. I think, our main challenge in the field still remains the issue of social closeness, friendships, and just interactions beyond the routine, behind the superficial, in order to get some depth. To develop that kind of relationship that you and I yearn for. Life partners, good friends, good interactions with people, that goes beyond the obvious, hello, how are you? I'm fine, what did you do? That kind of stuff that we're very good at doing, because that's exchanges. Right. So I think if I reflect where we started, and and certainly where I started, and where I'm now, I start looking back and I listen to adult AAC users, and what I really hear them say is, you did a lot, but this is the gap. Yes. How we are included socially, how we really part, and not just, artificially or sitting in the classrooms or actually participating, and how we can really become a part of the community in that way. So for me, that's been something that I think is something that lies in the future. Okay. And interestingly enough, we recently finished a study in which we asked AAC interventionists, what are they training for? In other words, what is their belief? How do they perceive communication competence? Right. And it became very clear to me that people are very aware of this. They know that we're not very effective when it comes to that piece of, emotional closeness to others, and how to create that meaningful interaction that draws us together and makes sure that we want to be together again another time. At the same time, I don't really think that we have a good idea altogether how to do it. Because what we found very interesting was that all the people that we interviewed emphasized social interaction. However, very few of them really could tell us, what are the ways in which to do it. And what they really have found effective. So I guess my interest at the moment really lies there in terms of what are we missing. Okay. And whilst the technology is important and can always improve, and I think that's really critical, I'm not saying that's not important. Mm-hmm. I'm saying we have to bring the human back in the process. We have to bring meaning into the process, perhaps in a slightly different way than we've been doing it in the past couple of decades.
That's very interesting, Erna. In terms of actually exploring bringing to intervention a more human component and actually focusing on that interaction, what are your thoughts around how we go about doing that?
First of all, I think we need to start perhaps relooking our definition of communication for starters. I think when we start looking at communication as an exchange of information, I think we're missing something. Because really what friendship is about is something that we create between the two of us. So it's an openness for both of us to be able to listen and to create what I call new nuanced meaning. Okay, it's something that is a little bit of you, a little bit of me. And that is really what our individual gains are. It's not about just conventional meaning of sign, of what the symbol means. It's what are we adding? Because this is why we need to be here, and why that exchange can't just happen with anybody, And I think we've been I think, we have had to focus on the obvious in terms of the externals, getting people communicating, expressing. And I think what we in a way need to do is to ask ourselves, what is it that makes people sort of able to go beyond just exchanging messages, but to actually co-create in the middle? And with a piece of technology here, it is a challenge. So I think our training needs to start off where we're saying, what is communication all about? It's about seeing somebody. How do I see somebody? How do I really open myself to understand who that person is? And I think that's a bit of a different theoretical point of view from where we're coming with participation, because I think participation, is largely based on exchanges and how do we overtly communicate. I think the engagement piece is where we're looking at each other and we are able to really go beyond just turn-taking and making exchanges which could be on the surface really good. I'm not saying that our whole lives, is about creating with somebody, because a lot of what we do in the daily life is exchanges. But this is not what I'm interested in. I think my interest has spiked because of the lack of personal interactions that people have experienced. And so I'm starting to look more at the engagement side.
And with that comes a human connection.
Of course, yeah.
And also co-constructing, you said, meanings and messages. And in a sense also implies something about the person that you're communicating with. They've got to sort of exhibit a kind of willingness to listen.
Exactly.
And listen at a deeper level. And give the time to actually listen. And you've actually termed that, in a sense, empathetic communication.
Yes, we've got this project on empathetic, the art and science of empathetic communication at the moment. Because I was sort of thinking, how is the approach that I've been developing for a long time, as you would know. We're talking about engagement and participation. And I started to realize perhaps the difference here is I think we understand perspective taking. I think we realize that to get into your shoes means I need to understand your perspective. So I need to know your background. I need to know what you did before you came here. And you can help me if you're verbal, or if you're nonverbal, you can communicate a little bit. But that's very important. But that's a cognitive component. This is what we call cognitive empathy. But there's a huge other field, the affective empathy field, which goes beyond that. That means I'm able to feel with you. And we know that when Carl Rogers started with empathy in the clinical context, there was a very strong emphasis on just listening and emotively being with a person. But that's quite different from, empathetic communication, because we can't all be Rogerians. And I don't think that's communication, Communication is about this middle thing that, the creative synthesis of what we're developing here in the middle. But at the same time, it's not just on a cognitive level. And I think friends are very good at getting in tune on emotional resonance. And I think one of the things that we haven't paid attention to in AAC is also helping users of AAC to start realizing how important it is for them to become more emotionally in tune. Some of them are able to, like many of us, naturally develop it. But, for others it's just quite a bit more difficult. And I think the other piece is, in partner training. Okay. We have been very oriented towards helping the exchange flow. And as I said, participation is important. But it's the link between the engagement and the participation that I'm really interested in, because that's developing meaning between people. And that's the uniqueness of our relationship that's going to draw me back. And if there's nothing unique like this, why will I come back? Unless forced to. So I look at situations in the classroom, where teachers create opportunities for children to do things together. And I observe and I see, but there's nothing really happening to get those kids to come back to each other. And so there's a piece that we need to think about in this, how to create that, so that the children are more able to sort of, become sensitive towards each other and how each other perhaps also is feeling, and how they feel in the situation in order to develop friendships. And I'm very interested in that.
Because ultimately that's communication. It's about the connectivity.
Exactly.
And that's the purpose it, I think, serves for everybody, is to get that kind of connection with other people, to feel understood and to understand.
Exactly. I think that's very important. Sometimes with people with motor neuron disease, for example, the person would lose his speech and the spouse would say, but I understand, we're happy together, And I think there's an important message there that we need to be very conscious of. And that is that there's something more than just what we see as the verbal interaction. And that aspect of it's also important when you speak. And that in some way we need to look at both. Obviously, when kids develop language, etc., the expressive is very important. And as I said, language is important, there's no question about it. But I'm just saying the whole process of communication and friendships go a little bit further, and we, I think, need to start paying more attention to what is it that that intrinsically motivate us to actually keep on communicating. Absolutely. And how do we help other people to explore and start becoming a bit more sensitive to it. And it's difficult, as I said, because it's not easy with technology. But I also think the way in which we're going to approach the technology when we approach intervention from this angle might differ. You're still going to need skill in operational skill and that kind of stuff. So I'm not saying it's either or, but I do think there's a different sort of type of angle to it.
From your research perspective, I'm really interested to know, how do you, from what I understand, you've sort of got a theoretical understanding of this concept of empathetic communication. And how do you then take that into something that can be researched, whether you use it qualitatively or quantitatively? And I know it's still a process, but how do you actually go about deconstructing that?
Oh, Shakila, that's tough. That's really difficult,
Yes.
But I think that's why
it's interesting.
Yes, and that's why we're in the field. Yes. Look, I think if we don't research, if we're not interested in researching this, I think we're limiting ourselves. We're limiting our own intervention. I think And having said it's difficult, as you say, is identifying the challenge that we need to address. I've often obviously thought about this, and we've done some work on sort of researching empathy. I think there are a couple of things I can say about the research. First of all, I think any concept, I mean, obviously when you start doing research, you have to know what you're going to research. Mm-hmm. You have to be able to, basically unpack the concept of empathetic communication. Mm. And at its very elementary level, you're dealing with cognitive empathy and affective empathy. Right. And then, of course, how the two interact. So most of the studies on theory of mind, stuff like that with children with autism is concentrated on the perspective-taking piece. Right. And I think that it's very important that we realize that, we also need to actually train and understand better the emotive piece. And that is not that easy to actually assess from a verbal point of view, from an expressive point of view, because very often people are not necessarily in touch enough to be able to verbalize. That's a different level. So we need in a way to go back to how do people, how does empathy, and particularly affective empathy, manifest itself? And we can only do that by making recordings, asking people to rate it, and say to them, rate this on a scale of empathetic, communication. Where do you think this rates? So you start on the global level to actually come closer to the definition of what you want to look at. Okay. And that's one way, and then you obviously get a range of this is good, and there's a lot of it here we think, and there's not a lot, because the truth is, all of us are not always empathetic in communication. That's true. Mm. You can't be. Mm-hmm. But once you have an idea of an array of manifestations or communication situations and the different levels of, empathetic communication as people perceive it, I think it's a good starting point for us to start looking at. So what's the difference between this and that? Mm-hmm. In terms of nonverbal behavior, in terms of how people communicate, and how things are actually sort of, coming synthesized. I'm very interested in that, and how is meaning developed between people. So, if anything, I think this type of research will approach empathetic communication from a meaning point of view, from a strong emphasis on the development of meaning, but then really look at the different manifestations and the differences between people who are really empathetic and situations where the same people might not be empathetic. And then, of course, realizing that it's going to be different in different contexts, but we're looking at what are the kind of ways in which we can facilitate our understanding of the affective part of interaction together with perspective taking. There's quite a bit done in nursing on this, actually, but not in terms of how the discourse develops. It's much more sort of just on the overt side of, the nonverbal stuff, which is fine. It's a start. Whatever we do, we're going to reduce, and I think that's the important thing to remember.
That for me is an interesting way of approaching it.
Yeah.
To actually observe a phenomena and then from that analyze and see what are those components that make up empathetic communication and how it might be present in some situations and not in others. I think for me that's quite a novel way of doing it, because we often think it comes purely from the theory, whereas in a sense you needed that to be able to see what you're going to see in the videos. But I think the videos also is going to inform that theory in a sense.
Absolutely. You see, because as I said, at a rudimentary level, and I do think it's rudimentary, we talk cognitive, affective. Probably the other terms that once we really start looking at it, concepts that might be more helpful, that we don't, that we haven't considered. the whole concept of intersubjective interaction, intersubjective self-awareness, self-other awareness, you know, and how that translates to how technology facilitates or become a barrier towards that. You know, I think there are lots of interesting stuff, you know, that we can do here. But it's a new field of interest. You know, it's a new development. So I think small steps. And I think the important thing is that we must remember that any research we do is always reductionistic. You know, you must always concede that, well, you know, this is an interaction between two people, and that it might manifest differently in other contexts and other situations, but small steps are important in actually developing the field. So,
thank you very much.
oh, thanks, Shakila. It
Thank
was
you.
so nice talking to you.
Same here.